The political compass, an internet zeitgeist that helps simplify political ideology so that every person can understand it and understand what their own political ideology is at a deeper level. Or is it? Is it that, or is it just a garbage model for understanding politics? Today, I'm going to be debunking the political compass and going over everything that's wrong with it. The test itself, the ideology behind it, its definitions, the way it labels certain countries not even according to its own definitions, and its massive political bias that it claims to not have. But first, what is the political compass? The political compass is a political test created by New Zealand journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker Wayne Brittenden, consisting of 61 propositions, not questions, and don't you forget it. Based on your responses to these propositions, the test places you on a compass ranging from left-wing to right-wing on the x-axis, and libertarian to authoritarian on the y-axis, creating 4 distinct quadrants. By definition, you could only have 4 quadrants. They are authoritarian left, authoritarian right, libertarian right, and libertarian left. The introductory video and the analysis section of the Political Compass website state that the purpose of this test is to be more descriptive than the simple left-wing, right-wing distinction, which they claim falsely implies that a government-driven left-wing economy always necessarily coincides with more socially liberal attitudes, while a free market right-wing economy coincides with authoritarianism. The introductory video also claims that the political compass is a universal tool that's free of any agenda and shows you the entire political landscape, not just the one within your country's politics. So, does it actually accomplish that? Absolutely not. These claims are absurd. The idea that the political compass is more descriptive than a basic left-wing, right-wing distinction, that it covers the entire spectrum of political opinions, that it has zero agenda are incorrect on so many levels, which we'll go over today. It's not descriptive, it doesn't cover all possible ideologies, and it has a massive agenda, even if Wayne Brittenden isn't aware of it. Not only that, but the political compass also doesn't seem to know what it's measuring, doesn't define its terms, flattens and homogenizes ideology, and treats ideology as if it's a thing in your brain disconnected from material reality, rather than a guiding set of principles for your actions. Unless you're a country and that it's supposedly descriptive of your actual actions, but only as viewed through the lens of Western mainstream news media and popular culture. So basically, the political compass, in claiming to have zero agenda and to represent all possible political ideologies, simply reproduces and perpetuates the ideological biases that already exist in the West while failing to actually measure political ideology, which makes it a terrible tool for understanding political ideology. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So here's everything wrong with the political compass from my perspective as a... Well, I'm not going to tell you where I fall in the political compass because it's not a good tool. And I am biased, but I admit it, which is way better than claiming to be unbiased while being biased. For a test to be useful in any capacity, it must be both reliable and valid. A reliable test is one that yields consistent results under the same conditions. A valid test is one that accurately measures what it purports to measure. If you weigh yourself 3 times using the same scale and get the same reading each time, you know that that scale is reliable, but if it's off by 100 pounds or kilograms or whatever units you use from your actual weight, then it's not valid, despite being reliable. It may be giving consistent measurements, but they are not correct measurements. I'm sure we can all agree that claiming that you can measure your bowling skills by averaging your top 3 scores in Wii Sports Bowling would be absurd. Such a measure of bowling skill would definitely be invalid and not actually measure what it claims to measure: your bowling skill. It might be reliable because there is a technique to being good at Wii Sports, so you could get consistent scores under similar conditions, but those scores would not meaningfully measure how good you are at actual 3-dimensional real-life bowling. You'd get laughed out of your bowling audition, or tryouts, or whatever they do. I don't actually know anything about bowling. So how does the political compass fit into this? As established earlier, the test consists of 61 propositions, not questions, and don't you forget it, and claims to measure where your ideology falls on the 4-quadrant compass, which is supposed to encompass all possible political viewpoints with zero agenda, a lofty goal. The test instructions specify that propositions are different from questions, that you shouldn't question the logic of these propositions because then you're missing the point. Some propositions are extreme and some are moderate, which is how they determine how extreme or moderate you are on the compass. These instructions are followed by the statement that your responses should not be overthought. Some of the propositions are intentionally vague. Their purpose is to trigger reactions in the mind, measuring feelings and prejudices rather than detailed opinions on policy, which makes it very clear that all that the test can possibly measure is your instinctual mental reactions, feelings, and prejudices in response to certain propositions, which is not what makes up one's ideology, or at least it shouldn't be. A political ideology can be defined as a set of beliefs about the proper order of society and how it can be achieved. The political compass somewhat covers the first part, as you can see from the instructions, but definitely not the second. It doesn't ask at all how you think anything could be achieved, so it can't meaningfully define or label your ideology by just asking questions that cover only half of what an ideology is. Sorry, propositions. The point of having a political ideology is to understand how reality works, and then do stuff in the real world with a set of ideological principles guiding your actions. Not to just have the correct thoughts and sit around thinking about how correct you are and then feeling superior to others because they're not as correct as you. That's actually really easy to do and yields zero material results aside from possibly alienating you from others because you think you're superior to anyone who disagrees with you. This is a problem on all sides of the political spectrum. If you want people on your side, don't do that. However, the political compass not only endorses this idea that ideology is just mental, immaterial vibes that have nothing to do with material actions, material conditions, or historical and cultural context, but it also perpetuates the idea that ideology is just vibes further by claiming that their test can determine where your political ideology falls within the full spectrum of political ideology based on how you vibe with certain propositions. Which again, have nothing to do with how you behave in real life or what you think should be done in order to make those propositions a reality. Both of which are an important and instrumental part of political ideology. You can't not include real-life behavior or how one thinks certain propositions should be achieved and correctly measure political ideology because then you're leaving out half of the definition of political ideology. The political compass essentially just reproduces the Cartesian dualist lens through which we tend to view reality in the West, and treats the material and the mental as different, distinct entities rather than two sides of the same thing. Essentially treating ideology as just the thoughts and ideas that you vibe with, that live in your mental realm, rather than something that actually shapes your behavior, how you move through the world, what you view as acceptable in the behavior of others, what goals you think society should strive towards, how you think those goals should be achieved, and what you're doing to achieve those goals. It admits in its instructions that it's basically just measuring vibes with a fairly limited set of propositions, and I would argue that these propositions absolutely do not encompass the entirety of the political spectrum, especially because the political compass does not provide a consistent definition for what it considers to be left, right, authoritarian, or libertarian, all of which are criticisms that we'll get into way more later. If the propositions themselves don't cover the entirety of the political spectrum, or even the entirety of what encompasses a political ideology in the first place, then there is zero way that the results themselves can be representative of your place within the entirety of the political spectrum, making it an invalid test that can't possibly measure what it claims to measure: your position within the entire political spectrum. At best, the political compass is just a test representing where one guy, Wayne Brittenden, thinks you fall in the entire spectrum of political ideas that he happens to be aware of, based on what propositions you vibe with rather than any meaningful measure of your political ideology. This all means that the political compass test cannot be a valid test by definition because it can't measure what it claims to measure, which you can tell before you even take the test, given that the instructions alone, which are an important part of the test, show us that the test defines ideology as something mental, immaterial, instinctual, and unrelated to what you do or think should be done in the real world. In the political compass, ideology is just your mental prejudices and feelings, but measuring vibes is not measuring ideology. By definition, the political compass might be a reliable test because you'll probably get the same results if you take the test under similar conditions, but it's definitely not valid, and even then, it's not even that reliable. And this is all even more obvious when you look at the actual propositions themselves. I know the instructions say not to question the propositions because then you're missing the point, but since the propositions are what determine your results, which again claim to represent your political ideology within the entire spectrum of all political ideologies, it sounds like they'd be kind of important to question. So, I am going to question the logic of some of these propositions, specifically to further demonstrate that the political compass test is absolutely not valid and does not measure what it claims to measure: where your ideology falls within the entire spectrum of possible political beliefs, even though we now know that it's only measuring vibes anyway. The majority of propositions, as we'd expect from the instructions, Don't measure what someone thinks needs to happen in material reality, but just what you think is a good idea in theory. As a result, these propositions can be interpreted in a multitude of different ways, but yield the same score for people with vastly different beliefs. There is one proposition that states good parents sometimes have to spank their children, which ties into the last point in that it's really the only proposition that has anything remotely to do with one's material actions. Maybe. But the rest are like, I'd always support my country, whether it was wrong or right. What is support? Send money to the government? Pay taxes when it's time to pay taxes? Not denounce your country on social media? Praise your country on social media? Give a high five to every government official? Go to war in the Middle East to secure access to oil for the bourgeoisie of your country? Give your firstborn child to? What is support? What is support? Like, send good vibes to? I'm gonna send good vibes to my country. That doesn't do anything. Another proposition states the rich are too highly taxed, which strongly disagreeing with could mean that you want to guillotine every single rich person on site and then expropriate and redistribute their wealth to the people, or it could mean that you want to raise their taxes by 5% over the next 20 years if you can vote in people that would be down to do that. And that's the same thing in the context of this test. Strongly agreeing with that proposition could mean that you want to give every rich guy an extra yacht, $1 million subsidy for their business, and 5 wives, or that you think that the rich are too highly taxed because you think taxes shouldn't exist in general, so you think everyone is too highly taxed. And in the context of this test, that's the same thing. Even though ideologically I would say those people are different. There's also the proposition that governments should penalize businesses that mislead the public, and strongly agreeing with this could mean taking every C-level executive out back and taking care of them Luigi style, then putting the company in the hands of its workers and putting measures into place to curb similar issues in the future. Or it could mean fining the business $200 and giving them a slap on the wrist. And those mean the exact same thing in the context of this test. Holding either belief would make you equally left on the political compass. Strongly disagreeing could mean that you think that businesses should be allowed to put as much sawdust in your Rice Krispie treats as you want without consequences because it's a great strategy for maximizing profit. Or it could mean that you're so anti-government that you think that the government can't meaningfully do anything other than commit acts of evil, so even penalizing a business would be categorically evil when it's done by a government because it's a government. And both people would be equally right-wing, even though their ideologies are probably pretty different, though both views are kind of absurd. Strongly agreeing with the proposition, it's a sad reflection on our society that something as basic as drinking water is now a bottled, branded consumer product, can mean that you think it's a sad reflection of our society, but that there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it because such is the state of modernity, tragic as it may be. It could also mean that you think that clean water should be free and accessible to everyone, and that privatization of necessities that humans need to live shouldn't even be possible. It could also mean that you think that the CEO of insert corporation here needs to be adjusted. Again, all the same thing in the context of this test. Viewing ideology in this Cartesian dualist way, with ideology being vibes-based and existing separately from material reality, is literally how liberals are programmed to see the world. And by liberals, I don't mean like the Democratic Party of the US, even though they are included in this definition. I mean anyone who believes that the right to private property is important and who thinks that capitalist liberal democracies are the peak form of government, which also includes conservatives. To liberals, ideologies are just the thoughts you have in your head about what you think would be good to do, an ideal of sorts rather than something that guides your material actions and determines what you actually do. Support isn't anything material, it's just thinking that a person or an idea is good and sending them good vibes. Ideology is just about what should be done, ideally, if I was ruler of the world, in theory, rather than a set of principles that helps you understand the world and guide your material actions in the real world. It's all about living in an idealistic fantasy possibility land rather than determining what needs to be done in the real world around you based on your material conditions. To a liberal, ideology also apparently has nothing to do with how the thing that you think should be done will get done, at least in the context of this political compass test. A lot of the individual propositions within the political compass test also don't even measure what they're supposed to measure, which also means that the test can't possibly be valid. You can see this in propositions like, when you are troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. Some people are naturally unlucky, and astrology accurately explains many things. all of which supposedly have to do with how authoritarian you are. I mean, they don't have anything to do with the economy, so that's kind of the only option. According to the test, which I did take a million times while changing just one response at a time to check this, luck, religion, and controlling your thoughts are all authoritarian things, while astrology is libertarian. Even though any kind of person with any kind of ideology can believe in luck, religion, or astrology, or that it can be useful to distract yourself and tell your mind to shut up when it's doing psychic damage to you. Or you can believe in none of those things and have a similar ideology to someone who believes in all of those things. None of those are inherently representative of one's political leanings. There are definitely high-demand, high-control religions out there like Mormonism. And yeah, I mean, I guess you could call them authoritarian, but that's not every single religion. Like, look at Unitarian Universalists, Irish pagans, various indigenous religions, for example. None of those are high-demand or high-control. There's also a woo-woo spiritual crunchy granola hippie to alt-right pipeline that exists, and occultism and mysticism were a large part of literal Nazi ideology and mythology, so being spiritual does not magically make you more libertarian. Otherwise, I don't think you'd end up with that pipeline. According to the test, which includes the proposition that abstract art that doesn't represent anything shouldn't be considered art at all, abstract art is also libertarian, even though the work of abstract expressionist artists like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko was used as a weapon of the Cold War by the CIA to show how much artistic freedom the West had compared to socialist nations. Which doesn't sound very libertarian to me. Another proposition states people are ultimately divided more by class than by nationality, which also supposedly measures how left-wing you are, because being left-wing means only thinking about class, I guess, even though anyone who has actually studied Marxism would understand that class divisions are further heightened by national divisions. Workers in the global South and the global North are both exploited by our respective ruling classes, but the exploitation of the global South allows us in the global North to have access to luxuries that the majority of the global South can't access, like smartphones, rechargeable batteries, and other electronics, the components of which are often mined by global South workers like those in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in slave-like conditions. Our comfort in the global North relies on the exploitation of the global South, and according to Oxfam, if you make above $38,000 a year, you are in the richest 10% of the world, even though you may not feel particularly rich if you're in the global North and making that much. So if you know all of that and are economically left-wing, like a Marxist or a communist or what have you, you can very well disagree with that proposition and it'll push your score to the right. Or you can be economically right-wing and part of the ruling class and believe that, yeah, class is the main dividing factor, because if you're a billionaire, everyone else seems poor to you and you probably want to keep it that way. So yeah, I guess you could see it that way. I mean, Warren Buffett literally said, there's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. So yeah, you can easily be part of the ruling class and believe that class is the main dividing factor and not magically become left-wing. Whether you think it's a good division that we should keep or a bad division that needs to be done away with is irrelevant in the context of this proposition. So what is it even measuring? Vibes. Only vibes. And not even that, really. Either that or Warren Buffett is left-wing, which he is not. The proposition protectionism is sometimes necessary in trade also measures how left-wing you are, because the test seems to believe that protectionism, the idea that you need to limit international trade via things like tariffs to protect domestic industries, is the government doing stuff to the economy and therefore left-wing, while international trade is not the government doing stuff to the economy and therefore right-wing. Even though capitalism, a right-wing ideology characterized by private ownership of the means of production, is not synonymous with trade or with the government not doing stuff to the economy. Capitalism just means that private individuals or corporations, who are also individuals thanks to corporate personhood, own the stuff you need to perform labor, like factories, facilities, tools, productive land, and so on, and the working class, who doesn't own any of that stuff, works for these owners for a wage. And we kind of need those wages to survive. And we make money not just by owning stuff. Meanwhile, socialism, the collective ownership of the means of production where, for example, workers collectively own and make decisions about the factory they work at and can fire their boss if he's being terrible, is not even mentioned in this test in any capacity, aside from the proposition that, from each according to his ability, for each according to his need is a fundamentally good idea. Which again, does not actually get into how you'd achieve such a goal because it's just measuring vibes. Like, a liberal who is by definition right-wing, given that they support capitalism, could easily agree with that statement and all the ones about regulating corporations and taxing rich people, because They think we just need to vote in people who want those things while keeping the current systems intact, and they would still fall into one of the left quadrants despite not actually being left. You can't like capitalism and be left by definition. This test and the introductory video that explains the test also truly seem to believe that left-wing economics is when the government does stuff and right-wing economics is when the government does not do stuff, which is a concept that we'll talk about shortly, so put a pin in that, but yeah, that's not how that works. The way the questions are weighted is also super weird, because if I answer the last 2 pages the opposite of how I would normally, my score ends up being only slightly more authoritarian and slightly more right, even though now I'm homophobic, think that you need religion to be moral and that religious values should be taught in schools, and believe that the government should tell people what to do in the bedroom. Apparently those things are only mildly authoritarian, whereas believing in eugenics, being generally pro-establishment, and beating your kids are all more authoritarian than being homophobic or believing that the government can tell people what to do in the bedroom. Even though those concepts are also rooted in the same eugenicist logic. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, told his SS soldiers that all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. It's also honestly pretty whack that believing in eugenics or being homophobic or believing that private affairs are actually the government's business are just presented as cute ideological quirks rather than the components of a harmful ideology that leads to mass death in practice. What's up with that? I don't like that. Like, I know that those are things that people believe, but they shouldn't. It's a bad thing to believe. It creates many contradictions that you can't really resolve. So basically, all this to say, the test does not and cannot truly measure what it claims to measure, which is where your political ideology falls within the entire spectrum of possible political ideologies. It can't possibly do that when, as it says, it's just looking at your instinctual mental reactions, feelings, and prejudices, which are not what make up a political ideology, or when it flattens all the political ideologies into only what is covered by its 61 propositions while leaving out everything that falls outside of those propositions. Again, all it's doing is measuring where Wayne Brittenden thinks your ideology falls within the spectrum of ideologies that he's aware of, but take our quiz that shows where one guy thinks your ideology falls within the spectrum of ideologies that he's aware of is not good marketing, so of course they would never frame it that way. That's way less fun and effective than promoting it as a universal, all-encompassing, agenda-free tool. The idea that there's zero agenda in the political compass is an agenda in and of itself. It's like how the US mainstream news media claims to have zero bias and to tell you the whole truth, which is impossible because everything is full of ideological bias and everything has a particular framing to it, even if you're not aware of what it is. There's also no way to encompass the whole truth or the entire spectrum of political beliefs, especially as a singular individual creating a test, because one perspective is one perspective, and one perspective about all the perspectives can't actually cover all perspectives. As American political scientist, historian, and author Michael Parenti wrote in Inventing Reality, The Politics of News Media,
"What is objectivity? One's perceptions are inescapably selective. Subjective judgments and biases are introduced even before the writing begins, at the moment one defines what is to be considered a story. Total objectivity, whatever that might be, is impossible. Perceptions of events are inevitably influenced by past experiences, dominant social beliefs, and the limitations of the human condition."
Saying that you have zero bias and zero agenda usually just recreates and reinforces the bias and agenda of the dominant ideology, which is the ideology of the ruling class that is maintained through cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is a term first coined by Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, which refers to how the ruling class maintains rule in capitalist societies through ideological and cultural means like the media, the education system, the political system, culture, and the like. Under capitalism, the ruling class is the private individuals who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, the Warren Buffetts of the world, and people like the United Healthcare CEO that just got murked. I mean, sorry, his claim to life was denied. And through cultural hegemony, we are taught that those people being at the very top of the hierarchy is just the natural order of things. It's how things are and have always been, and those people on top deserve it. It's like divine right of kings, but like the divine intelligence and business acumen of the bourgeoisie. They deserve it because they're so smart and rational and good at business, is what we're told. And if you want to be a billionaire capitalist, then start your own business with a small $300,000 loan from your parents. Get on that Sigma grind set. Oh, your parents don't have $300,000 just lying around? way to make excuses for your failures. You're clearly just jealous that these people are better at business than you. The claim that the political compass has no agenda just further reinforces the cultural hegemony of the ruling class by reproducing their class interests and assuming that the current state of things is just the natural, immutable order of society, which is why the political compass test can't possibly cover concepts like whether the means of production should be owned collectively by the workers or privately by owners who don't do any work, whether state power should be wielded by the working class in a dictatorship of the proletariat or by the owning class in a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie like what we have now, whether you need a socialist transition period before achieving a stateless, classless, moneyless society, or if you think you can just magically jump straight into the classless, stateless, moneyless society. The political compass quiz assumes that private ownership of the means of production and a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, like what we have in pretty much all Western nations today, is the only possibility, and the propositions very much reflect that and don't allow for any alternatives. It literally can't possibly cover all ideologies when it assumes that the way things are now is the natural order of things and leaves out anything left of social democracy. I'm sure monarchists aren't into that either, because they want a monarchy and not a bourgeois democracy. The political compass quiz can't ask whether racism and other forms of bigotry are natural and immutable facts of life, or an expected byproduct of an economic system that benefits from dividing people based on things like class, race, and so on, especially to exploit the labor of marginalized populations for as cheap as possible, and that also increases as economic conditions worsen. Instead, all it can ask is, are you homophobic? Are you racist? Do you like eugenics? Should we tax the rich? Should we support people who can't work? Do corporations need regulation? All of which assume that the test taker is in a liberal democracy and wants to keep it that way, but with some slight variations based on what propositions they vibe with. It also frames eugenicist, racist, fascist, misogynistic beliefs as just as politically valid as anti-eugenicist, anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-misogynistic beliefs, rather than as harmful ideologies that shouldn't be propagated. But of course, a liberal who thinks that ideology is just what's in your head and not the driving force behind your actions would see these terrible things as individual ideological quirks and not drivers of policies of mass death. Which again, yikes. Once you finish the test and get to the analysis portion, you can see this zero agenda, aka the totally obvious Western liberal bias that assumes that private ownership of the means of production and a liberal democracy are the default, in action, especially in the way that it defines its terms. The introductory video to the political compass labels the economic left as 100% government-driven, and the economic right as 100% free market-driven. In the post-test analysis section, it shows you this image of where different countries fall on the political compass and basically states that it's using those same definitions of left equals government-driven and right equals free market-driven. Which again, not how that works, but we'll get to that soon. To rank the economic leftness or rightness of these countries, it uses the Index of Economic Freedom that was created by the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation. You know, the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank, probably most well-known right now for Project 2025, and its 1981 mandate for leadership, the conservative, neoliberal, pro-business, pro-deregulation, pro-privatization, anti-labor think tank whose policies were implemented by the Ronald Reagan regime in the 1980s, whose pro-business, pro-deregulation, pro-privatization, anti-labor policies have ultimately weakened unions, led to stagnation of real wages, increased the number of people living in poverty, and worsened economic inequality, all of which are objectively terrible outcomes unless you're a rich guy who benefits from other people being poor. That's not most of us. The Heritage Foundation, whose research fellows write articles about how people are having fewer babies because people are taking too long to receive higher educations and aren't involved in religion enough, and the solution is not to give these people money for having children, but to discontinue government programs that make having children less likely. Which in practice means that they want to give less money to support public secular education, which they admit. Yeah, they want to cut public education funding so people make more babies. That's weird. I probably wouldn't want to listen to those guys. Yeah, let's trust the guys who benefit from framing poverty as the result of poor individual choices rather than an indicator of systemic failure, and who think that we need to cut funding to secular public education so people have more babies to tell us how to define economic freedom. No, let's not do that. But according to the political compass, there's no agenda, even though their definitions of economic left and economic right are very clearly informed by a right-wing think tank with a neoliberal, pro-business, anti-labor agenda. The introductory video also claims that the political compass's new social axis of libertarian to authoritarian helps expand on the left-right distinction that makes us falsely believe that all left-wing governments are libertarian while right-wing ones are authoritarian. But in its attempt to create a second axis, it literally just recreates the same limiting left-right axis, but like vertical this time. I mean, it literally admits this in this sentence on the post-test analysis page. Conversely, a country may be very right-wing, i.e. libertarian, in its economics and be authoritarian at the same time. Singapore is a perfect example. Okay, so this new social scale is libertarian to authoritarian, but the economic scale is also libertarian to authoritarian, but with the economy? Why are you mixing terms if they're supposed to be different axes that represent different things? Probably because their definitions of left and right are based at least in part on what the Heritage Foundation thinks, and as a pro-business, anti-labor conservative think tank, they definitely think that a capitalist system with minimal regulation, low corporate taxes, few tariffs on imports, low government spending, and the like is the most free economy, the most economically libertarian. Because it is to foreign investors and businesses who want to make a profit in those countries. This means that, conversely, high tariffs, high corporate taxes, high government spending, and lots of regulation are automatically considered left-wing. Which again means that in the context of the political compass, the leftness or rightness of the economy has nothing to do with who owns the means of production or in whose interests the government runs, but only how much stuff the government does to the economy. And an economy that the government does the least stuff to is considered the most free and the most libertarian, which is nonsense. That we'll debunk soon. I've said this like 3 times already. We're getting to it. This is the framework that the political compass is using. Hey, quick question. Are you more free in a country where you have to buy private health insurance on the free market just to get substandard care with zero guarantee that the insurance will actually cover the medication or treatment that you require? Where a huge portion of your salary goes to your housing, where you can go into debt to pay for your university or medical bills, where there's consistently an economic crisis every 4 to 6 years, where employers can basically fire you on the spot but just call it workforce reduction layoffs in order to drive up their own profits, where you have to pay money for childcare, where the price of food and housing goes up year by year, where there's minimal regulations regarding food and water safety, where the corporate capital gains tax is relatively low and you have slightly higher salaries than the rest of the world, which you kinda need to pay for your expensive medical care, housing, food, bills, childcare, and the like. Or are you more free in a country where healthcare and university are free and guaranteed, so there's zero chance of having medical or student loan debt, and the entire populace is highly educated? Where you are guaranteed a job in your field, where housing is guaranteed and costs about 3 to 10% of your salary, so there's basically zero chance of becoming homeless, which also means that you never have to encounter homeless people, ever. Where there's a high homeownership rate because of how affordable housing is, where there's price controls on the things you need to survive, like food, so stuff is typically about the same price relative to your salary, even during global economic crises. Where there's regulations that ensure that your food and water is safe and not full of sawdust, where things like childcare and cheap, healthy food are freely available, and where the majority of corporations are owned by the people who work for them, so you have a say over how the company where you spend the majority of your waking hours runs. But your salary is slightly lower because you literally get everything you need for almost free. If you're the private owner of a large corporation, or perhaps an employee of the Heritage Foundation or any other right-wing think tank that promotes neoliberal free market ideology, you'd probably prefer the low capital gains tax and higher salary, and probably wouldn't care about everything else because it probably doesn't matter to you whether university costs $0 or $100,000. You likely have the money to cover it and can basically get access to whatever you need, you know, if you have that money. If you're a regular person who doesn't own a corporation or other means of production, which is most people by design, you'd probably feel a lot more free without the threats of unemployment, homelessness, starvation, and medical debt looming over you, right? Let me know if you like having those threats looming over you. If you do, you'll probably think you're a special case who's immune to such things. Did you know that there's homeless people with master's degrees and PhDs who are homeless due to a natural disaster like a fire, flood, or hurricane, the death of their spouse or parents, or a sudden onset illness or disability? Any of those can happen to anyone, and yet according to the Political Compass website itself, having an economic safety net for such occurrences is not really relevant to economic freedom. And none of those nice things I mentioned, like free education, cheap guaranteed housing, or free healthcare, are very highly weighted as indicators of economic freedom in the Economic Freedom Index. To be considered economically free in the Economic Freedom Index, a nation needs to adhere to the Heritage Foundation's view of economic freedom, which is based on the following: rule of law, property rights, government integrity, judicial effectiveness, government size, government spending, tax burden, fiscal health, regulatory efficiency, business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, and open markets, trade freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom. Basically, things that don't matter to most individuals and only matter to corporations, aside from, like, labor freedom and maybe investment freedom. Although about 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and about 72% of those people have less than $2,000 in savings. So I don't think investment freedom really matters to people who have nothing to invest because they're using that money for survival, which is most people. And again, most people under capitalism don't own private productive property by design, and thus need to work to make money rather than making money from owning stuff. However, unlike what the Heritage Foundation thinks, economic freedom does not come from having low corporate gains taxes, the right to own private productive property, a free market, and a government that bails out banks and failing industries during an economic crisis, but leaves regular people to suffer. But for some reason, the ideology behind the political compass seems to support that that's what economic freedom is. So much for having no agenda. If the political compass thinks that right-wing economics are libertarian and full of economic freedom, that means that left-wing economics must conversely be authoritarian. As stated earlier, it views left-wing economics as 100% government-driven and right-wing economics as 100% free market-driven. This is complete nonsense. You can't separate the economy from the state, as they are deeply intertwined, with the state functioning as an instrument to maintain the existing economic order on behalf of the ruling class, which honestly explains why the political compass can't keep their terms and definitions straight and keep referring to right-wing economies as economically libertarian. If you're using the Heritage Foundation's definition of economic freedom, a state functioning in the interests of the ruling class seems way more libertarian because they're not going to regulate or tax your big business as much, whereas a state that runs in the interests of the people might penalize big businesses or not even allow businesses to get big in the first place. We do not live in a class-neutral society. We live in a society that runs in the interests of the ruling class, which in the capitalist liberal democracies of the West is the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. The main goal of the bourgeoisie is to maximize the accumulation of capital, and the state acts to preserve the conditions that allow the bourgeoisie to maximize that capital accumulation. The idea of a capitalist society ruled by the invisible hand of the free market with zero state interference is just a liberal fantasy. It's not possible, it's never been done, and it literally can't be done. The closest we got was maybe during the US's Gilded Age, when the country ended up with monopolies like US Steel and Standard Oil, and the majority of working class people lived in poverty, which was great for business. But even back then, the government was very much involved in shaping market forces, like when the Supreme Court used the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act to rule that unions were actually illegal cartels, and when businesses used the armed wings of the state to break up strikes. Just let the free market handle it. If workers want to unionize and strike, don't make the government get involved in the economy to stop them. That disrupts the invisible hand of the free market. Except there's no such thing as a free market that's completely divorced from the actions of the state. While the economic system determines the base of society, the state acts as a superstructural support, effectively enshrining the relations of production, so who owns the means of production, through legislation, policy, and enforcement. The superstructure effectively legitimizes and reinforces the economic system, creating a feedback loop where the government and the economy perpetuate one another. This is also where the cultural hegemony that we talked about earlier comes into play. That's the superstructure doing its thing. The state imposes laws about wages, working conditions, taxes, zoning, consumer protection, business regulation, economic development incentives, and tons of other things that impact the economy. Since liberal democracies are not class neutral and act on behalf of the class interests of the bourgeoisie, many of these laws serve the purpose of ensuring that the economy runs as smoothly as possible while maximizing profits for the bourgeoisie as much as possible. It's profitable to have a populace that has some level of education and can read, so the state provides mandatory primary education. It's profitable if workers don't sue corporations for causing physical harm to them, or if workers don't constantly perish on the job, so the state has to implement some level of regulation and labor rights to prevent that from happening. It's profitable if people need to buy an individual vehicle to get to work, pay a private company to acquire insurance for said vehicle, pay a government agency to register it, pay for parking, pay for vehicle maintenance, and so on, especially when compared with public transit. which is why the US has car-dependent infrastructure. It's not because cars are better or anything, but because car companies profit from perpetuating car dependency, so they lobby the government so that they can maintain their profits. And not every single law in a bourgeois liberal democracy exists simply for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, but a lot of them do. In the US in particular, the majority of lobbyists represent business interests and move those business interests forward, which in practice means that lobbyists for particular industries often enable the passing of legislation that serves the interests of those industries. They do this by providing policy research, sponsoring think tanks, assisting agencies with writing rules, drafting and amending bills, and building and maintaining relationships with key decision makers. This is how the US ends up passing policies like the bank bailouts of 2008, which cost taxpayers $700 billion to keep failing banks and other firms in operation. Even supporters of capitalism agree that bank bailouts like that keep the economy going, and that the economy can easily be tanked by an economic shock and require such government bailouts to get back on track. That's literally the government doing stuff to the economy on behalf of capital. The state influencing economic decisions and the economy influencing state decisions is what happens in all states, not just ones that are left-wing economically. You can't define left-wing or right-wing economics by how involved the government is in the economy, because the government is always involved in the economy. This is just another example of liberals framing things that every nation does as weird when a socialist nation does it. State involvement in the economy specifically. It's not weird. Everyone does it. Right-wing and left-wing are also qualitative labels that can't be measured by how much stuff the government does to the economy. Plus, how do you even quantify how left or right-wing a nation is? You'd need so many data points, and all the qualitative data points would have to be converted to some quantitative value just to fit on this binary scale. Which could probably be done, but probably not well, and it'd be a whole thing, and it would take forever, and it won't magically become objective just because it's quantitative, because the quantification of those qualitative things would be informed by the bias of the person coding and converting the data. You'd have to consider what trade agreements a country has with all other countries, whether there's any tariffs on trade, whether it's sanctioning any countries, whether it's being sanctioned and how that informs its economic choices, what social safety net it offers to its citizens, whether that social safety net applies to non-citizen residents or not. Who owns the means of production? How much of a say workers get in how their workplaces run? How much of a say workers get in how their government runs? Because the government inevitably makes economic decisions. Whether the country engages in imperialism or neocolonialism, or both, honestly. Whether a country intervenes in the economic affairs of other countries, which is basically the same thing. Whether the country is a victim of imperialism or neocolonialism, or attempting to resist it in some way. Whether the country allows foreign investment and how common foreign investment is. Whether there's price caps on certain necessities or not, whether the state provides vouchers for certain necessities, or if everything is bought with currency, what the tax rates are for individuals, small businesses, large corporations, investments, and literally any other thing that could be taxed, whether there's taxes on sales or employment income at all, how easy it is to start a business, how people who aren't able to work are dealt with, whether new parents get parental leave, how retirement works, whether new parents are able to temporarily work reduced hours at the same salary or percentage of their salary to stay home with their baby more, what the country has to say about how its own economic system functions, whether there's homelessness or not, if there is homelessness, how that's dealt with, whether there's universal basic income programs or not, whether unions are allowed or not, how powerful organized labor is, whose class interests the state runs on behalf of. I could keep going, but I hope you get that this would require a lot of data, and the political compass is not taking any of those things into account, it seems. Instead, the political compass is like, North Korea is the most left-wing because the government does the most stuff to the economy. China is a little less left because sometimes the economy does stuff without the government telling it to. Singapore is the most economically libertarian because the Economic Freedom Index said so. Switzerland is also economically libertarian because it's number 4 on the Economic Freedom Index. That is the only rationale they provide in their analysis. Nothing about relations of production, which is an important part of the mode of production, which is an important part of the economy. It's so intellectually lazy, and I hate using that word because, like, people typically want to do stuff and be good at stuff, and if you're being lazy, there's usually a reason behind it, but the reason behind this is that the guy who made this quiz literally just defaulted to what he believes to be common knowledge to inform the political compass, which made this quiz an easy sell to other people in Western liberal democracies who have been conditioned towards the same homogenized understanding of politics. As we established, socialism is not just the government doing more stuff or the government being in charge of the economy or whatever. Socialism is qualitatively different from capitalism in that the entire state apparatus works on behalf of the people rather than on behalf of capital, which can look a lot of different ways, as can capitalism. But it's really convenient to capitalists to frame socialism as just the government being large and efficient and bureaucratic, thus leading to an economy that's not free or authoritarian. But like, all governments do stuff and intervene in their economy as we established. If being left-wing simply meant the government doing stuff and right-wing means the government not doing stuff and having low taxes, that'd be absurd and nonsensical. Like, well, let's go over some examples so you really get the point. Okay, this'll be fun. Guess what two countries on this political compass image from the official website itself have zero tax on employment income? Why, surely it must be the two most economically free ones, right? Because taxes are economically authoritarian? Okay, let me help narrow it down. These two countries also both have free universal healthcare and free university. Well, that sounds pretty left, according to how the political compass defines left and right, because the government has to fund those, and that means that healthcare and university aren't private businesses. The government's involved in the economy. One of these countries is religious, which is authoritarian, and the other one is secular, which is libertarian, but neither legally allow religious proselytizing as a method of disrupting the social order, which, I don't know, maybe that's authoritarian or like neutral. The secular one mentions that citizens all have equal rights, that women hold an equal social status to men, and that there is universal suffrage. The religious one doesn't mention anything of the sort, but the Constitution does state that the council that advises the head of state must be no less than 20% women. The private sector accounts for 38% of the economy, and state-owned enterprises account for 29% of the economy of the secular state. I guess the remaining 67% must be some secret third thing, because that information is impossible to find, and the previous information is 3 years out of date, so who knows? But let's roll with what we have available. For argument's sake. In the religious state, privately owned enterprises account for 45% of the economy's GDP, while one particular resource accounts for 40% of the GDP, and most of that resource is handled by an enterprise that is majority state-owned, like almost 99% state-owned. Taxes on corporate income are a flat 20%, which is on the low side compared to the global average of around 25%. Wow, 40% of the GDP is from a state-owned enterprise, free university, and free universal healthcare. Well, that sounds pretty left-wing to me, if I were using the political compass's definition of left-wing, which is the government doing stuff in the economy, which all of that is. But there's no taxes on employment income, and the corporate tax is on the low side too, so maybe it's a right-wing libertarian paradise? Or is it just a centrist utopia with all the best left and right policies? I don't know. Do you think Saudi Arabia is a centrist utopia? You probably shouldn't. Yeah, I don't think it is. It's very much a state capitalist economy, and yeah, 40% of its GDP comes from oil, most of which is controlled by Saudi Aramco, a company that's 1.5% publicly owned and 98.5% government owned. Oh man, that sounds like the government doing stuff to the economy, but somehow it's right-wing according to the political compass because it can't even keep its own nonsense definition straight. The political compass defines left and right wrong and then doesn't even stick to its own definitions, I guess because it's easier to defer to a right-wing think tank. Don't get me wrong, it is a right-wing state capitalist nation, but if left-wing economics is the government doing stuff in the economy, then it should be at least in the center given that nearly half of its GDP comes from essentially a state-owned enterprise. And it has free education, free healthcare, benefit programs for widows, orphans, and people who can't work due to their disabilities, subsidies for baby formula, paid maternity leave from 4 weeks before birthing to the 6 weeks after birthing, lots of instances of the government doing stuff in the economy. How left-wing? Not really. Social programs are not inherently left-wing. Meanwhile, manufacturing and mining account for 58% of the secular state's GDP. The corporate tax rate is about 25%, which is pretty much average on a global scale when weighted by GDP. But it also varies depending on the industry, the size of the enterprise, and whether the company is foreign invested or not. So it's got no taxes on employment income, a pretty average corporate tax rate, and one that's pretty low for certain industries, free healthcare and education, like Saudi Arabia, fairly equal distribution between state-owned and private enterprises, universal suffrage. Well, I guess that's probably center-left, right? Meanwhile, it's the country that the political compass thinks is the most left and has the most government doing stuff economically, North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as they call themselves, and I'm pretty sure the political compass ranks it as far left because it has a score of basically 0, well, 2.9, on the Economic Freedom Index, and not because the political compass understands relations of production. Article 20 of the DPRK Constitution states that the means of production are owned only by the state and social cooperative organizations, and Article 21 states that the property of the state belongs to the entire people, and that only the state possesses all the natural resources, railways, airports, transportation, communication organs, and major factories, enterprises, ports, and banks. All of that does make the socialist DPRK state socialist ownership qualitatively different from state capitalist Saudi Arabia's state ownership of Saudi Aramco. The DPRK has a different class character and runs on behalf of different class interests than bourgeois liberal democracies like most Western nations, or capitalist monarchies like Saudi Arabia, which is a big part of why the DPRK is so demonized in the West. If you feel compelled to leave an annoying comment about how the DPRK should be demonized because it's evil and authoritarian, please chill out. We haven't even debunked the concept of authoritarianism yet. And I don't really trust the authoritarian regime that wiped out 20% of the DPRK's population and destroyed about 85% of its infrastructure, and who commits countless atrocities at home and abroad to tell me how to feel about a nation that they constantly demonize and make stuff up about. The most negative opinion that a Westerner should have on the DPRK is no opinion until you go there and experience it yourself. And if you live in the US, you probably won't be doing that for a while because your own government won't let you travel there. But you can at least go watch Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang in Seoul, or My Brothers and Sisters in the North, or read Susie Kim's Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution, or any work by any of North Korea's leaders, so you can have an educated opinion rather than one that's just like, come on, it's evil there, everyone knows it, because it's so bad. And if you think I should go and see it myself and want to contribute to my Send Revolutionary Thought to the DPRK Fund so I can go there, you can send me a one-time tip on Ko-fi or PayPal, or support the channel on a recurring basis on Patreon. Anyway, the political compass has no clue what it means by left or right, conflates left-wing economics with the government doing stuff and right-wing economics with the government not doing stuff, and then doesn't even follow the definition. It's literally just deferring to the Economic Freedom Index to label countries, which is an agenda. A right-wing one. What a mess. Not only does the political compass not really know what it means by left and right, but authoritarian and libertarian aren't really defined either. Like, they kind of are in the statement that Uruguay is currently rated the world's 44th most free economy, and a leading Latin American light in social freedoms, from gay and lesbian rights to legalization of cannabis. Switzerland also has a high rating as a libertarian economy, while at the same time providing a wide range of social welfare programs, in common with the Nordic states, and a number of other Western countries. But that's it really, that's all the definition you get. So based on this statement and the propositions themselves, we can conclude that the libertarian-authoritarian axis is based on whether drugs are decriminalized or not, whether there's equal rights for queer people, and I assume women, whether there's social welfare programs, which I would guess is more of an economic thing, but okay. Wait, no, is that paragraph just switching what they're talking about halfway through and once again using libertarian to mean economically right-wing? But they also low-key make it sound like social welfare programs are libertarian socially too, so whatever, I don't think they even know, honestly. Whether a state is religious or secular, whether the state determines what goes on in people's bedrooms or not, the legal status of adult content, the level of surveillance, whether abortion is legal or not, whether a country aims to uphold traditional family values, and whether a country allows the questioning of its authority or not. I would also guess that a libertarian state would be one with a low crime rate, and where people can just walk around at night and feel safe. But that doesn't actually factor into the political compass's definition at all, because China has a generally lower level of crime than Uruguay or Switzerland, and is more authoritarian on the political compass, so who knows? Since the political compass analysis mentions gay rights and legal cannabis as libertarian things, we can assume that those things are weighed the most heavily when it comes to labeling a state as libertarian. Based on the test itself, we can also assume that the legal status of adult content and consensual sexual relations between adults are also taken into account when determining how libertarian a nation is. So let's look at what makes Uruguay slightly less libertarian than Switzerland. So gay rights are libertarian according to the political compass, so let's look at those first. Homosexuality has been legal in Uruguay since 1933, same-sex marriage has been legal since 2013, queer people can serve in the military, gender-affirming care has been legal since 1997, trans people can legally change their gender, forced surgery on intersex infants is fully banned, very cool. Gay men can donate blood under the same conditions as everyone else, conversion therapy is banned, employment and housing discrimination against LGBTQ+ people is banned, gay couples can adopt kids as of 2009, It's honestly doing amazing in the queer rights department. Good job, Uruguay. Based on the political compass's own definitions, I would expect Switzerland to be more libertarian about all that stuff. At least slightly, right? Because it's slightly more libertarian than Uruguay on this graph. So let's see if that's true. Switzerland legalized gay marriage in 2022, but had an age of consent of 20 for same-sex sexual acts until 1991, though now it's the same for everyone. Trans people are banned from serving in the military. Gender-affirming care has been legal since 1995. Trans people can legally change their gender. There's no countrywide ban on intersex infant surgery. Gay men can donate blood under the same conditions as everyone else as of 2023. The legal status of conversion therapy varies by region. There are no countrywide protections for queer people when it comes to housing or employment discrimination. Gay couples can adopt kids as of 2022. Okay, so maybe Switzerland is not quite as queer-friendly as Uruguay, apparently. But maybe it's more libertarian because it's got a more libertarian drug policy? Let's compare the two. Uruguay became the first country to legalize and regulate marijuana in 2013, and Uruguay does not criminalize drug use or possession, though trafficking is illegal, so if you have a lot of something on you, you could go to prison. In fact, drug possession for personal use has been decriminalized in Uruguay since 1974. Cannabis can be purchased legally at clubs and pharmacies or self-cultivated, though these methods are mutually exclusive and residents must choose which way they'll be attaining it and then register with the Uruguayan IRCCA, Instituto de Regulación y Control del Cannabis. Lo siento, no hablo español. What about Switzerland? Apparently they give out heroin prescriptions to heavy users, which originally started in 1994 with 1,000 heavily dependent users who were involved in dealing and other forms of crime, and has expanded so it's now used as a treatment for individuals with severe opioid use disorder, which has reduced the illegal heroin trade in Switzerland. It's a very limited cohort that's allowed to receive this, though. Like, only 45 people received take-home doses during the first lockdown in 2020. But I guess it might possibly be slightly easier to get it in Switzerland than in Uruguay if you're addicted to opioids. But I don't actually know, and I don't think that info's available on the internet. Also, you can't just be like, man, I really want to try prescription heroin just for funsies. Please prescribe it to me, Switzerland. That won't work. You have to, like, have a medical reason to need it. Cannabis is harder to get in Switzerland than in Uruguay, and you can only grow hemp or have cannabis in your possession if it's less than 1% THC, which is not a lot. If you're caught using cannabis, you may be fined 100 francs, and if you're caught with less than 10 grams in your possession, you won't be fined, but it'll likely get confiscated. If you want to legally get zooted, you gotta be involved in a scientific pilot trial involving cannabis. Switzerland has a 4-pillar approach to stop drug use that involves harm reduction, treatment, prevention, and repression via law enforcement, which, according to them, focuses more on shutting down big-time dealers rather than on arresting or prosecuting users. So, it sounds like drug use is generally less illegal in Uruguay than in Switzerland, and that personal use is completely decriminalized in Uruguay, and you will only get in legal trouble if you get caught engaging in trafficking. Like, you don't need a heroin prescription or to enroll in a cannabis trial to legally engage in those substances. So why is Switzerland more libertarian then? Is it because it's super easy to buy firearms there? But that's not even a proposition or mentioned in the analysis portion of the test at all, so that shouldn't be counted because you can't measure authoritarianism or libertarian based on a metric that isn't even included in the test itself, or in any of its associated materials. Is it something about regulating bedrooms? Switzerland and Uruguay both have fully legalized prostitution, which requires sex workers to register and be licensed, but only Uruguay gives social security benefits to sex workers. So it's not that. What about religion? They're both secular states with no state religion, but the preamble of the Swiss constitution starts with, "In the name of Almighty God," so it's literally not that. Compulsory education, perhaps? They both have 11 years of compulsory education. They've also both outlawed the death penalty, yet only Switzerland has compulsory military service. So why is Uruguay less libertarian than Switzerland? Is it just because it's in Latin America and Switzerland is in Europe? Is it because the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute, 2 right-wing libertarian think tanks, said it's the most free country in 2023 in their Freedom Index? Is it because Uruguay is part of the map that's usually all red on freedom indexes made by the American Burger Eagle Freedom Institute and other right-wing think tanks? I think so. Yet again, the political compass has definitions that it can't even properly stick to or elaborate on. I'm starting to think this Wayne Britton guy does have an agenda, and it's a right-wing one. Or it's just a weird coincidence that the political compass's analysis lines up perfectly with that of right-wing and right-wing libertarian political think tanks. Is it intellectual laziness or an agenda? Who can say, but either way, the result is the same regardless of intent. Anyway, we've discussed what makes a country libertarian, So let's talk about what makes a country authoritarian, and in that we are coming back around to North Korea, the secular state with universal suffrage and equal rights for women. How authoritarian? In the political compass analysis, it says, nevertheless, the more nationalistic and authoritarian a party or individual is, the more right-wing they're still labeled. This, of course, is absurd. Taken to its logical conclusion, it means that the further left a country sits, the more socially liberal its attitudes are. On that basis, North Korea must be a shining model of human rights and social freedoms, which is not an argument. Come on, it's North Korea! Is not an argument. This is again just reproducing the Western liberal bias that assumes that private ownership of the means of production and bourgeois liberal democracies are the natural order of things, and that anything outside of that is a heinous aberration that needs to be destroyed and not just like a different way of running society. Everyone knows North Korea is authoritarian and bad is not an argument. If you think it is, wake up. You've been programmed. Look, I can snap. Sometimes I can't, sometimes I can. I don't know, what's up with that? That's not a truism that everyone knows about because it's so obvious. It's just the dominant narrative of the ruling class. It's a meaningless, homogenized statement that does nothing but enforce the dominant ideology that every time a country tries socialism, it's authoritarian and not worth it, so you should just accept the status quo because anytime anyone's tried something new, it's literally turned into 1984, an animal farm. It's literally George Orwell. Again, the political compass just flattens ideology and supports the homogenization of ideology by reproducing the dominant narratives of the ruling class. It does indeed have an agenda, regardless of whether Wayne Brittenden is aware of it or not, which is being able to frame capitalist nations as libertarian in terms of economics and social policies, and to normalize and universalize the concept of bourgeois liberal democracies, while framing socialist nations as more authoritarian in terms of both their economic and social policies. It also doesn't know anything about other countries beyond this generic homogenized understanding that everyone has just from existing in and absorbing this bourgeois liberal ideology. Of course, a European country must be the most libertarian rather than a Latin American country. Of course, right-wing economics means economic freedom. Of course, North Korea is authoritarian. Everyone knows that. It's common sense. It's not common sense. It's bourgeois propaganda. And I don't know if Wayne Brittenden necessarily intended to do all this normalization of the status quo with this cute little quiz, but that's what it does in practice. But okay, whatever, so maybe Korea might have some authoritarian qualities, like it traps children into what are known as slave contracts, essentially turning them into indentured servants and forcing them to live in ascetic dormitories with the promise that maybe one day they can be a famous pop star, all while preventing them from speaking with their family members and prohibiting them from having romantic relationships in any capacity. And this exploitation and authoritarian control over their lives often leads to eating disorders, a lifetime of trauma, sometimes even crippling debt if they don't achieve the superstardom required to pay back the costs of their dancing and singing lessons, living accommodations, and so on. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm thinking of K-pop. That's just in South Korea, not all of Korea. Okay, never mind. That's totally fine then, because K-pop is like so cute and fun. Oh, no, how could that be evil? Look at that. That's cute. Well, okay, so Korea does put people in jail if they say anything neutral to nice about the other Korea or its leadership. Wait, no, that's South Korea again. There's literally an old man in jail in South Korea who was in jail for the crime of writing a poem about how if the Koreas reunited under a socialist system, they'd all get a free healthcare, education, and housing, and fewer people would take their lives and live in debt. Okay, so maybe Korea does have the 4th highest suicide rate in the entire world, especially among the elderly who feel like a financial burden, and students who feel high levels of pressure to succeed academically or else there will be negative material consequences. Plus, it's got the lowest birth rate in the world, probably because people don't want to bring kids into such a high-pressure environment, and because young people can't really afford anything, there's a lack of available housing, it's a highly patriarchal society where women fear that their careers will stagnate if they have kids, and... Wait, no, that's South Korea again. That's specifically South Korea. Okay, well, in May 1981, Korea had a student uprising where about 200,000 demonstrators came together to protest its brutal dictatorship, and this uprising was violently crushed by the military with approval from the US's Carter regime. It was so brutal that we still don't even know the real death toll, which is estimated to be around 1 to 2,000, though official government estimates put it at closer to 200, but are you really gonna trust the numbers produced by an authoritarian regime? Oh my god, I'm so sorry, that's South Korea again. That was the Gwangju uprising. Whoops. And yet, I've never heard any Westerner mention how concerned they are about the poor people of South Korea having to deal with their authoritarian dictatorship of a government. Gee, I wonder why. It was also the South Korean president who recently declared martial law, and it was blocked by the parliament like 6 hours later. But still, some South Koreans are claiming that it feels like a coup d'etat is happening over there. President Yoon Suk-yeol has defended his martial law decree and claimed that he will fight to the end whether he's impeached or investigated after the first impeachment vote failed due to a boycott by his party, the People Power Party, which is a name that low-key gives National Socialist vibes. But it's fine, he said he's just doing it to defend democracy. Yikes. Similarly, it was in South Korea in the 1970s that women textile workers attempting to unionize were suppressed by their all-male management, who threw human excrement into their offices specifically to prevent these women from unionizing, so they could do something about their horrific working conditions. The union collapsed, the women attempting to unionize were fired, and the union leaders were tortured or beaten by South Korean police, an armed wing of the South Korean state. And yet, I've never heard any Westerner treat South Korea as some goofy evil cartoon villain where the people in power just do evil for fun while its poor citizens are powerless to do anything against it. And I've definitely never heard any Westerner call for the toppling of South Korea's authoritarian regime like they do with the DPRK. What's up with that? The real reason we view the DPRK as an authoritarian hellhole and the Republic of Korea as just like a normal country but with a different culture than ours, even though the president of South Korea recently tried to declare martial law, is because the Republic of Korea is a US ally and the DPRK is not. And in fact, the DPRK had 85% of its infrastructure and 20% of its population wiped out by the US during the Korean War, so wonder why they don't like us, huh? And Western propaganda has taught us to view nations exercising their sovereignty, resisting Western imperialism, and attempting to keep out external saboteurs as authoritarian. The political compass is yet again just repeating Western liberal propaganda. The DPRK is in the position it's in specifically because of US imperialism, so we in the US and the rest of the West are in no place to judge how they resist imperialism. Maybe just don't do imperialism if you don't want nations to be repressive, I don't know. The more unstable a nation is, the more repressive it becomes. This is just how things work. Although Saudi Arabia is also a US ally while being considered socially authoritarian on the political compass, but it's considered economically libertarian, which makes it less scary than an authoritarian economy with authoritarian social policy, even though, as we established earlier, the DPRK has universal suffrage and women and men have equal social status and rights, which is not the case in Saudi Arabia, and which should make the DPRK significantly more libertarian than Saudi Arabia if the political compass followed its own definitions. We also know that Saudi Arabia has been cracking down on drugs and executing drug traffickers, but we don't really know the legal status of drugs in the DPRK. Although, according to Radio Free Asia, they love opium and meth over there. Which might be the case, but we literally don't know because Radio Free Asia usually just makes stuff up. Pick Me Up, I'm Scared has 3 whole episodes about the US Agency for Global Media and its many offshoots, including Radio Free Asia, so check it out if you want to learn more about that. I mean, the DPRK is also somehow simultaneously one of the 6 countries that allows abortions on demand throughout the entire duration of the pregnancy, and also punishes doctors for performing abortions and handing out contraceptives. Which is it? It literally depends on the ideology of the person writing the article. If they think that abortion is healthcare, which it is, then the DPRK hates abortions. If they think abortion is bad, then the DPRK has the most abortions. In fact, everyone living there has been aborted. Also, the Washington Times, which says the DPRK is too loose with its abortion laws, as is the US, according to the Washington Times, was founded by the same guy who founded the South Korean anti-communist homophobic cult called the Unification Church, Sung Myung-moon, who considered himself to be the second coming of Christ. Also, Shinzo Abe had ties to this cult, which is also known as the Moonies. Anyway, you probably shouldn't trust either of those sources and just accept that we'll probably never know the DPRK's internal policies on things like abortion or drugs as long as the West remains hostile towards them, because the West is invested in framing everything the DPRK does as absurd and comically evil. It's literally the same treatment that the USSR received from the West when it was still around. As Michael Parenti states in Blackshirts and Reds,
in the United States, for over 100 years, the ruling interests tirelessly propagated anti-communism amongst the populace, until it became more like a religious orthodoxy than a political analysis. During the Cold War, the anti-communist ideological framework could transform any data about existing communist societies into hostile evidence. If the Soviets refused to negotiate a point, they were intransigent and belligerent. If they were willing to make concessions, this was but a skillful ploy to put us off our guard. By opposing arms limitations, they would have demonstrated their aggressive intent. But when in fact they supported most armament treaties, it was because they were malicious and manipulative. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed. But if the churches were full, this meant that the people were rejecting the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, as happened on infrequent occasions, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. A scarcity of consumer goods demonstrated the failure of the economic system. An improvement in consumer supplies meant only that the leaders were attempting to placate a restive population and so maintain a firmer hold over them.
Yeah, that's what the West does to any socialist nation that's around right now. Do you have a positive view of socialist nations? I'm guessing probably not unless you've studied them on your own. Yeah, that's by design. Sorry to tell you, you're not an independent freethinker. None of us are. That's impossible. Okay, so in terms of gay rights, homosexuality is criminalized in Saudi Arabia, and the punishment for being caught doing homosexual acts is the death penalty. Gender-affirming care is legal though, so a lot of gay people undergo gender transition because it's a lot safer than living in fear of potentially getting executed by the state. The DPRK, unlike Saudi Arabia, has no specific laws criminalizing homosexuality and no laws banning gay marriage in the constitution, so who knows why they're the same level of authoritarian, because having the death penalty be the punishment for a benign thing is way worse and way more repressive than a lack of laws regarding the benign thing, right? Although we obviously don't know exactly what's going on in the DPRK in practice, because the only perspective we get on what's going on there is heavily biased and invested in presenting it as negatively as possible. Also, South Korea, which used to be the same exact country as the DPRK before the US split it up, is not a beacon of queer rights, so it'd be absurd to expect the DPRK to be the most progressive queer-friendly place given that it shares a history with the extremely sexless and fairly homophobic South Korea. Plus, countries that are homophobic are typically that way for a material reason, and not just because they're spontaneously authoritarian and evil, and I mean, that sucks. And it often has to do with colonialism. Read Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Liberation, a Marxist View, to learn more. But framing foreign interventions in enemy nations as being in the name of queer liberation is just going to make those countries think that queerness is an astroturfed movement meant to destabilize their nations, which will in turn make them more homophobic. So let's support queer people worldwide by not supporting foreign intervention in other nations, okay? Let the people there figure it out themselves. We are not the world's police. You don't know better than someone else just because you live in a Western liberal democracy and they don't. Actually, here's a great Leslie Feinberg clip about this exact topic.
They outlawed and mandated sexuality and the roles of women and men and how many sexes there could be. And now they say, gee, things aren't so great in all these countries for gay people and women. Let us go reinvade and fix it. We have to be able to have a historical view for this. And to understand, too, I think that people in other countries who may be same-sex, oppressed based on their sexuality or their gender expression or their sex, don't need to be defended against their own people and their own cultures and their own populations in order to have solidarity with us. It's just the opposite. We need to be able to defend their right to their entire people's right to self-determination and sovereignty. Now, it was the British mandate that brought anti-sodomy laws to Palestine. And it was the French mandate that brought it to Lebanon, where Helem, the LGBT Lebanese group, is fighting to try to overturn that colonial law. One of the things that the Arab women were saying at this conference is, don't tell us that your solidarity is based on the fact that, oh, you're so brave to be Palestinians. You know, don't defend us against our own people and our own culture. Defend our Palestinian struggle for self-determination and sovereignty, and let us do our own internal work. within our own population. That's the way to defend us.
Okay, great. Now, moving on. There's literally no reason that the DPRK and Saudi Arabia are labeled as equally authoritarian according to the political compass's definition when one kills you for being gay or trafficking drugs and the status of the other one is totally unknown. It's, yet again, just reproducing our Western liberal anti-communist bias with its assumptions and attempting to frame everything that socialist nations do as inherently authoritarian, evil, and totally unusual. This is what mainstream Western news media frequently does when discussing any socialist nations, including the DPRK, China, Cuba, and the Soviet Union when it was still around. Come on, it's North Korea! Yeah, that's not an argument. All this treatment of socialist nations does is conflate socialism with fascism and authoritarianism, and that's not helpful at all for actually understanding socialism, but very helpful for the ruling class because then those of us who would benefit from collective ownership of the means of production don't question the current status quo because we assume that anything will be worse than what we have now, regardless of how bad the status quo actually is. In Anna Louise Strong's 1941 book, The Soviets Expected It, she mentions how the conflation of socialism and fascism is actually extremely misleading and dangerous. The most dangerous propaganda lie of our decade has been the constant and deliberate coupling of the USSR with the Nazis under the word communazi or even the word totalitarian, a phrase which most Soviet people have never heard. It has been repeated so often that possibly most Americans think that the Soviet people, or at least their theoreticians, consciously denounce democracy as the Nazis do. On the contrary, they have always consciously claimed it. Lenin's phrase was, "Soviet power is 1,000,000 times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic." Their criticism of America and Britain has never been the Nazi sneer at effete democracy. The Soviet people have criticized us for not being democratic enough, since we cannot control through our government, as they do, the productive mechanism which dominates our lives. But the political compass clearly didn't get this memo, and is still out here claiming that socialist nations that work on behalf of the people are just as repressive and authoritarian as Saudi Arabia, a place where women couldn't drive or vote until very recently and where you get killed for being gay. If I were to redesign the political compass test to make it an actually good test, it would probably look more like this, and the propositions would be about who should own the means of production, whose interests the state should run in, how bigotry is produced, how to deal with bigotry, and whether you want to achieve your vision by any means necessary, or if you think maybe you can make incremental progress towards a better world by voting in better people and reforming the current system. There would be no libertarian or authoritarian portion because that just doesn't exist in real life. As we discussed earlier, the political compass lives in immaterial idea land where it doesn't really consider what you actually want to happen in real life at all, and instead it looks at whether you vibe with certain propositions or not, which is also why it thinks that authoritarian and libertarian are meaningful terms. They're not. Much like how every state is involved in the economy, every state also engages in state repression of those it deems its enemies. To varying degrees, of course. I mean, it's not all the same, but it's just a predictable things that states do, given that a state's main aim is self-preservation above all else. So the level of repression varies, but there's always repression. Is that good? Is that bad? It's just a thing. As a famous libertarian left political activist and scholar once said, "While the state exists, there can be no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state." I'm just kidding, that was Lenin. But he's right. States are inherently repressive, which is why the aim of Marxism is to move towards a classless, stateless, moneyless society after a socialist transition period. Nearly every state has a military, a police force, and prisons, which are all entities that exert the authority of the state. The more unstable a state is, the more repressive it becomes of people whose ideologies and actions it believes threaten the interests of the ruling class, whoever that may be. Remember that before you cheer about sudden regime changes in countries that the US labels as enemies. Who's the new ruling class that I'm cheering for? What do they want? Who are they repressing? Are some great questions to ask yourself. But anyway, state repression in reaction to instability is just a predictable thing that happens. The more unstable a nation is, the more repressive it becomes. The authoritarianism of states that the West demonizes, makes stuff up about, and or bombs is typically a response to those external attempts at sabotage rather than those countries just being regressive and terrible for no reason and hating freedom of speech and whatever. Is that good? Is it bad? It's just predictable. Not everything has to be examined through the lens of morality and placed within a good-bad binary. Additionally, certain formal civil liberties, like freedom of speech and freedom of expression, that are viewed as libertarian and aspirational in bourgeois liberal democracies, are often just a concession that the ruling class gives us so that we feel like we have more freedom than we actually do. In Albert Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union, Szymanski states that it can well be argued that the existence of formal freedoms, which are utilized only by an isolated few to challenge the dominant ideology and institutions, actually contribute to real unfreedom, that permitting a few people who have little or no impact to speak against the system is, in fact, more repressive of real freedoms than the denial of that formal right. The existence of a few small newspapers, critical speakers, university professors, or very small leftist parties on the ballot implies that formal freedom is real, that people are free to choose, and they do, in fact, choose freely to follow the system. Such repressive tolerance is an important mechanism whereby people in the West are convinced that they are free, and that those in the socialist countries are not. Our conceptions of what makes a nation libertarian or authoritarian are very much rooted in our Western liberal bourgeois conditioning that makes us view things like the right to own private property, which most people don't own, and freedom of speech and expression, which are rights that most people don't use, as indicators of freedom rather than things like having control over how your workplace is run, having the ability to oust a boss, CEO, or politician that's causing harm, or having a state apparatus that works in the interests of the working class. Additionally, negative freedoms like freedom from homelessness, poverty, starvation, unemployment, and the like are extremely important, but none of those are guaranteed in most of the West, and thus are not weighted as heavily when dissecting the human rights violations of other countries, especially when compared to freedom of speech or freedom to own private property. We are taught to be more afraid of restrictions on freedom of speech and expression than we are of policies that literally lead to mass death, like economic austerity measures that pretty much always increase poverty and homelessness, even though the latter is actually way scarier. That's why some Westerners say absurd things about how some nations aren't truly free because they don't have access to Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or whatever. Like, is having access to Twitter really your only metric of well-being and freedom? That's weird. No one I know that uses Twitter actually enjoys it. Or X or whatever it's called now. I don't know. Dead naming Twitter is okay. It's the only time it's okay to dead name. My boy Friedrich Engels debunked the concept of authoritarianism in his essay on authority 152 years ago, essentially stating that we cannot abolish nation-states and authority without first abolishing the conditions that give rise to nation-states and authority. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the political state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and will be transformed into simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished in one stroke, even before the social conditions that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? Someone will always wield power, and it's better for the working class if the working class is wielding that power and can make decisions that are good for the working class, rather than having the bourgeoisie in charge and making decisions that are good for maximizing shareholder profits. And the working class being in power is better than leaving room for the old bourgeoisie ruling class to take back over post-revolution. But people still keep bringing up this authority thing as if someone being in power is just inherently bad. Power is not a bad thing. Also, horizontal organizing very often still leads to de facto leaders taking power rather than leaders who have been elected through transparent mechanisms, and who can be held accountable by the people if they mess up. Horizontal organizing also often leads movements to becoming easily co-optable by outside organized forces that are willing to exert their power. Read Vincent Bevins' If We Burn, the Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution if you want to learn more about this. But I get it. Power can corrupt, and people don't typically like state repression and the state having a monopoly on what constitutes legitimate violence. And that's fair. Those things are objectively bad when used against the working class. But, well, in his memoir, Revolutionary Suicide, Huey P. Newton, founder of the Black Panther Party, who famously really hated cops, state repression, prisons, and the state monopoly on violence in the US, and who was imprisoned for 2 years after getting shot by a cop despite doing more for the safety and well-being of his community than just about any cop in the US thanks to the Black Panther Party's community survival and defense programs, said this about his visit to China. The Chinese truly live by the slogan, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," and their behavior constantly reminds you of that. For the first time, I did not feel threatened by a uniformed person with a weapon. The soldiers were there to protect the citizenry. He also mentioned that when he was being harassed by a Canadian reporter during his trip, the Chinese comrades arrived with the police and asked if I wanted him arrested. I said no, I only wanted him to leave my table. After that, we stayed in a protected villa with a Red Army honor guard outside. This was another strange sensation, to have the police on our side. As we can see in Huey P. Newton's words, the class character of the state determines who holds power and in whose interests the state acts. A people state acts on behalf of the people and will obviously do different things with their state monopoly on violence than a bourgeois state that acts in the interests of the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musks of the country. State repression in a socialist state does happen, but it's typically used to repress those who betray the people. In places like Vietnam and China, you don't need a vigilante to take out a corrupt CEO. The state will do it for you. They use their authority, yes, but their authoritarianism or use of authority is qualitatively different than that of the West. Yet again, socialist nations are qualitatively different than capitalist nations and aren't just on the opposite end of a binary spectrum. An authoritarian socialist state uses state authority on behalf of the working class against the bourgeoisie. An authoritarian capitalist state is like exactly what we live in now if you're in the West, where the state works on behalf of the bourgeoisie, and the armed wings of the state simply protect private property, or go to the Middle East to get oil. That doesn't help people, really. That's why in the US it's not actually that illegal to threaten working class individuals, but you can't say anything that could be perceived as threatening towards a corporation or else. I'm not saying that all actually existing socialist nations are perfect, though as someone living in the West, my opinion on that literally doesn't matter anyway. But they at least exist and are taking the steps to build socialism and work on behalf of the people. Once again, having the best ideas means nothing when you can't implement them in the real world. All genuine knowledge originates in direct experience, not in sitting around thinking about what should be done. And the real-world implementation of a new system is often messy and imperfect and requires constant iteration to improve upon. The only pattern that can't be corrected is a perfect one, and perfection is a direction rather than a state of being. I'd rather see an imperfect system moving towards perfection than nothing at all, which is not a concept that the Political Compass quiz is familiar with because it only cares about vibes and ideas rather than practice, and only looks at a snapshot of a country or a person's ideology rather than looking at the rationale behind their actions and the material conditions leading to the creation of certain policies. With its idealism, the Political Compass thinks that policy choices are the result of ideas rather than of material conditions, which is not actually the case. I mean, ideas have a hand in it too, but material conditions are primary. As Michael Parenti writes in Blackshirts and Reds, ideally it would be fine to have only local self-directed worker participation with minimal bureaucracy, police, and military. This probably would be the development of socialism, were socialism ever allowed to develop unhindered by counter-revolutionary subversion and attacks. Basically, siege socialism is a function of external repression and sabotage rather than a fun, cute quirk that socialist nations choose to take on just because they love doing human rights violations or something. Parenti also states that decentralized parochial autonomy is the graveyard of insurgency, which may be one reason why there has never been a successful anarcho-syndicalist revolution. So yeah, libertarian socialism isn't a real thing that exists in real life. Before anyone gets mad at me about this, this is the result I always get on the political compass quiz. I've always lived left, and I have been for the past 10 to 15 years, because I think you should question all authority, and I'm against eugenics and all of its various offshoots, like homophobia and telling people what to do in the bedroom. Libertarian capitalism also isn't real. It's just an idea that whenever someone attempts to put into practice, they end up with bears attacking people in their town, because having no government means there's no centralized body to deal with trash. Which is just such a basic concept. But anarcho-capitalism is honestly so conceptually goofy and contradictory that it's not even worth discussing beyond that. But Switzerland is real and it's in the lib-right quadrant. The political compass has no clue what it means by its own definition of libertarian and authoritarian, and thinks that a country that's got fewer restrictions on drug use and possession and no compulsory military service is less libertarian than Switzerland, so I wouldn't even trust that. The political compass is just not a good tool on so many levels. And I'm not saying that libertarian socialism doesn't exist in real life to say that we should uncritically accept all authority, create repressive hierarchies that don't reflect the wishes of the people, make all decisions from the top down, repress literally everyone who disagrees with the state, and have one guy in charge of everything we do, because that would be absurd. I'm saying that because historically there have been no successful, large-scale, long-lasting libertarian socialist revolutions that have accomplished nearly as much as socialist revolutions that made use of their authority. So many self-proclaimed libertarian socialists would be a lot better off accepting that reality and recognizing that they have a lot more in common with the leftists that they write off as authoritarian than they think. We are all subversive in the eyes of the state, and the bourgeoisie don't care what kind of leftist you are, so probably stop the online left infighting. I don't know. It literally does nothing to move forward the interests of the working class. The powers that be love it when we infight and create more and more niche micro-ideologies to separate ourselves from people that we agree with on 98% of things. It's really convenient for them. And I don't even want to tell you exactly how or what to think. I want you to follow your own inner authority and to construct a better world using your own gifts. Question any and all authority and hierarchy to ensure you don't create unjust hierarchies or abuse power in your own life. Figure out whose outer authority is actually worth listening to. Then you'll be able to figure out who deserves to be in charge of the people and what sorts of leaders you'd be willing to follow. Maybe you don't want to follow anyone. Great. So lead, if there's people who'll follow you. Organize change from the bottom up, or the top down, or both, depending on what you resonate with most and what your gifts and material circumstances allow for, and what your inner authority tells you. There's a lot of people out there, and we all have different ideas, gifts, perspectives, and so on, and that's a good thing, because one perspective is just one perspective. So we should experiment with a variety of tactics to figure out what works best to improve the lives of the people around us, given our respective material conditions. There's a lot of ways to improve the world. But don't just sit around and think about how you have the best ideas, and if only you were in charge of structuring society, things would be so much better. Everyone thinks that. It's a lot more useful to actually do something about it, like the Black Panther Party did with their community survival and defense programs, for example. Again, all genuine knowledge comes from social practice. You have to try stuff to see if it works in bringing about the better world you want to see. Also, study past successful revolutions, as well as the tactics of revolutionary political orgs like the Black Panther Party and the Socialist Patience Collective, and please stop buying into imperialist propaganda. In conclusion, please stop using the political compass as a shorthand for defining your own political ideology or the political ideologies of other individuals or entire countries. It is not a helpful tool and simply reinforces the homogenization of political ideology while recreating the Western liberal bias that assumes that private ownership of the means of production and a liberal bourgeois democracy are the default and the only way a society can and should be structured. Rather than creating an expansive and intellectually stimulating environment that makes it easier to discuss and expand on different political ideas, the political compass simply allows people to shut down ideas that fall outside of the quadrant that they identify with. That's also why r/political compass memes is an unfunny cesspool full of garbage memes that people seem to upvote just because they're like, haha, that person's in my quadrant, guess they must be right about this. But it's really 99.9% unfunny slop. Don't go there, you're not gonna find anything funny. I never do. Not only does the political compass fail to measure what it claims to measure, where your ideology falls within all possible ideologies with zero agenda, because it literally only covers the ideologies Wayne Brittenden is aware of. But it also makes people's understanding of politics worse with its nonsensical definitions like economic left equals 100% government-driven economy and economic right equals 100% free market-driven economy. Neither of those exist. That's literally impossible. With this faulty definition, the political compass also treats socialism and capitalism as two opposites of the same binary rather than two qualitatively different modes of production that serve completely different interests. It also doesn't actually define any of its terms beyond that, and instead defers to right-wing think tanks to define its terms, using the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index and the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index to label Switzerland as super economically and socially libertarian, and the DPRK as the most authoritarian left, without actually taking into account what policies make a country authoritarian or libertarian, which is just so intellectually lazy. Also, the whole mixing up of terms is a problem. Like, why create a new axis if you're just going to make it the same as the other axis and equate a right-wing economy with libertarianism? Probably so you can say that a country might be authoritarian, but at least it's economically free, unlike evil North Korea that's economically and socially authoritarian. Wayne Brittenden was like, people think economically left nations are socially liberal, but actually, right-wing nations are the most libertarian, economically libertarian. They're free. If you're economically and socially libertarian, then you're double libertarian. And if you're economically left and socially authoritarian, then you're double authoritarian. That's how Wayne Brittenden sees it. The entire point of this new social axis, ranging from libertarian to authoritarian, regardless of Wayne Brittenden's intent, seems to be to label socialist countries as odd for doing things that all countries normally do, like having prisons and a police force, to uncritically label US enemy nations as authoritarian, and to label capitalist nations as inherently more libertarian and free simply because they have more free economies and a free market, according to the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank, who thinks we need to cut funding to secular public education so people can make more babies. Yeah, I wouldn't really trust them. I don't know if they really know what freedom is. The political compass is a garbage tool. It doesn't further our understanding of politics and instead muddies the waters further. And it doesn't even facilitate the production of funny memes, which is honestly the least it could do. Sorry, Wayne Brittenden, I'm sure you meant well when you made this silly little quiz and just wanted people to find out what ideology they vibe with, but instead, you've created a monster, and not even in a cool, fun way. But it is fun to talk shit about. So I'll give you that. Thank you, Wayne Brittenden, for that. The Iconic Chasms quiz on the Political Compass website is great, though. I highly recommend taking that instead of the actual Political Compass quiz itself. Thanks for watching! This video was made possible by my amazing patrons on Patreon. This video topic was actually suggested by one of my lovely patrons, Andre, who also sent some very helpful inspiration and resources my way, and my patrons voted for me to make this video, out of a list of like 4 options. If you like my videos, consider joining the Patreon for ad-free, uncensored video, occasional behind-the-scenes content, and monthly rant videos about topics like my niche criticisms of the Soviet Union, the Soviet stance on lesbians in the 1920s, the war on drugs, and many more to come. You can also send me a one-time tip on Ko-fi or PayPal, and make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this with a friend if you feel compelled, if you have any friends that love the Political Compass or hate the Political Compass. Either way, yeah, do all the things. It really helps support the channel. What do you think about the Political Compass, and what did you think before watching this video? How does your political ideology inform how you live your life? A question that the Political Compass never asks you, so here I am asking you. Okay, bye!